Hey, what is up, everybody? I'm so glad you're here with me this week. I have a really great episode planned for you today on how to grow your audience. It is probably one of the top 3 questions I get, and I'm going to go in depth today into several strategies on how to grow your audience. And we're going to look at it from several different angles. So let's talk about first, like the main things you need to have, because I've worked with a lot of people on producing their podcast and growing their podcast. And there are some podcasts where you reach a point where you know the audience just isn't going to grow anymore because the podcast is about a certain topic or for a certain industry where the audience just isn't that big, or the audience that is going to follow this host is only a certain size audience. They aren't the rah-rah, inspirational, Tony Robbins, whatever type of host that is going to develop this huge audience that's going to follow them and grow to millions of people. So let's talk about some of the basics first. To grow your audience, number one, you have to have great content. Okay, if you need to go back a couple episodes and listen to my episode on what your first 5 episodes should be, go back and listen to that. You have to have well-structured content that delivers value to people, that listens to what the needs of your audience are and speaks to them. Number 2, you have to have great sound quality, hands down. Like, you know, you've heard me talk about this before. It's just like eating in a restaurant. If you're going to go to a restaurant, you expect them to serve edible food. You know, if you listen to a podcast, you expect the podcast to have sound quality that's not going to hurt your ears or be annoying to you. After 2 or 3 weeks, they're going to give up. They're just not going to stick around. So number 1, have great content. Number 2, have great sound quality. And then number 3, every time you record, speak to one person. Right now, I'm picturing that one person in my mind that I'm speaking to. And that's what you should do as well, because when you're speaking to that person, you want them to connect with that idea. So have great content, have great sound quality, and then make sure you're speaking to a person when you're actually recording. Basics. That's how basically to grow your audience. Now, let's think about things you can do once you've got all that down to actually do something to grow the audience. First of all, you want to focus inward, okay? You want to focus on the audience that you have. And then after you focus on the audience you have, you focus outward, okay? So let's talk about what that means. Now, here are some strategies when you're focusing inward to the audience that you have. First off, create shareable segments, okay? You might have your main interviews. You might have the solo episode that you've planned out where you're going to teach 5 things or whatever, but also try to have segments that can be easily shared, okay? Where people can grab, in most podcast apps, they can grab a few minutes of the episode and share that. Or you could post these segments on social media when you share them, and people will want to pass them around because they can listen to it very quickly. It's just things they can want to share on social that can be consumed quickly. And they can listen to it and they can get something out of it. So think about that. Think about, radio shows you listen to. They've forever used short segments that people can listen to really quickly while they're on their commute. TV shows operate in segments. If you think about like The Late Show or those types of shows, The Tonight Show, there are segments that people can consume and then be done with. It could be, shared on YouTube or something like that and be really powerful and be consumed quickly and enjoyed. Those are types of things that people want to share. And then the thing that you must do, everybody must do, is have calls to action that are about engagement. Okay, so the most common call to action that you're going to hear is to ask your listeners to rate, review, and share your podcast. Talk about who this episode would be great for, and could you please pass it on to them? Could you please go to Apple Podcasts and leave a review? And people do that because ratings and reviews drive public visibility in most podcast apps. If you're ever thinking about sponsorship, that's one of the places that people are going to go to see, hey, you might have 1,000 downloads, but you've got 100 reviews and it's from people that I want to talk to. So this is a very important call to action to use regularly. Another engagement call to action is just to ask your listeners for feedback. Ask them to send you questions that you can respond to. Ask them what they want to hear more of. Really get in their ears and find out what they're thinking. It's hard to do that with a podcast. You have to get them to email you or DM you or send you a voicemail over SpeakPipe or something like that. But you've got to know what your audience is thinking and answer their questions and get back to them. Now, I know this is uncomfortable. I know it's uncomfortable to ask people for things, but you've got to get over that. They are your listeners. They care about you. They know, like, and trust you, and they want to hear from you and they want to do things for you. You have to ask them to do it. Okay. And they will, and you will eventually get over it. And if you need to, record something that you use every week so you don't have to do it all the time. But again, it's going to be better if you can do it authentically and weave it into the normal aspects of your podcast. Now, the last thing you can do inwardly with the audience that you have is create something like a launch team or a marketing team where you are going to recruit people from your listener base, from your email list, from your social media followers. And you're going to ask them to, maybe on a certain date or every day, pick a group of different people and ask them to rate and review and share your podcast. Because what that's going to do is create more of a buzz around what you're doing. It's going to create a big marketing rock that you throw in the pond, differently than your podcast episodes, which are more small pebbles that you're always putting out there, constant content marketing. This launch team going out there and reviewing your podcast and sharing with their communities and sharing with their networks about your podcast is going to create some buzz. And then, as a thank you, provide them some type of benefit. Provide them, pick at random a few people to get an Amazon gift card or something like that, but give them some incentive for following through. Now, let's talk about outward focus. Okay, you've gone to your current audience first. You've asked them for feedback. You've asked them to share. You've done a launch team. You've created things for them in your episodes that they can share easily. What about outwardly? Okay, the first thing you want to do is borrow other audiences. Okay, what that means is going on other podcasts as a guest. This is going to be the best way to grow your audience. So you need things like a press sheet that you can send to other podcasters, and contacting podcasters you can join a community like podit.net. You can use services like Interview Connections or Interview Valet, where they will book you on other podcasts. But you want to have a really easy way for podcasters to want to book you, want to interview you. And that's a press sheet where you're going to give them your bio, you're going to give them your headshot, you're going to give them topics that you could talk about. You're going to suggest questions that they could ask you and tell them what your answer is going to be. So it makes their job easy for them. And when you pitch them, you're going to make sure you've listened to their show first and you're not just randomly pitching people. And I think I've talked about it before. I get several emails a day from people wanting me to be on their podcast. And a lot of times these emails don't even get my name right. Like, I can tell it's a cold email from some PR agency that they're just going down a list of podcasts that they have contact information for, and they're just sending out blind emails. You really want to make sure that you pick shows you could help, that you would be a good guest for that person's audience. And then you want to help them do the work to make it easier. And then when you go on those shows, instead of sharing a download, instead of sharing like this lead magnet that you pass out all the time, share an episode of your podcast. Okay. It's a lot to ask an audience that barely knows you to give you their email address. Okay, to download something. And even if they download that PDF you want them to download, it's going to go in their download folder and they may check it out. They may not. They'll totally forget about it. Whereas if you say, hey, go check out this episode of my podcast, I go way more in depth about this certain topic. That means that immediately those people, while they're on their device, can go over to the search function and find your episode, find you, subscribe to your podcast, and start a relationship with you. And then when you get to the end of this interview that you've been doing with this host, that has brought you on and shared you with their audience, have a standard evergreen call to action, whether that's your main site, your homepage, whatever, something that will stay consistent. Always be able to share that in addition to specific episodes that would really help the audience that you're speaking to. Now, let's also think about when you're bringing guests on your show. What you'd like to do is use the network of the guests that you have on your show to grow your podcast. But people don't automatically want to share their appearance on your show. Now, what you can do is get them to share by having them enjoy the time on your show. Okay. And the way you do that is you find out what they're passionate about. Like they talk about the same thing over and over and over and over and over. Try to find something that they don't talk about often, that they really care about. Go on their social media, see what they post from their personal life. See what really motivates them or they're passionate about, and ask them questions about that. Ask them about stuff they don't get asked about a lot, because then they will remember you. They will be more likely to share that interview because they got to talk about something that they really, really, really wanted to talk about. Okay. The next thing that can work really well is some type of product launch formula launch or product launch content. Now, if you're not familiar with product launch formula, this is a system developed by Jeff Walker. I recommend you get his book. It's called Launch. I will put an Amazon link in the show notes for it. But essentially what you do in a product launch, content style launch is you're going to warn people in your social media or whatever that something's coming. That's your first step. Hey, pay attention here. I'm going to be doing some teachings or something, a training next week. You'll want to pay attention to it. And then you're going to create 3 short videos, and you're going to post them. Maybe you could go live or whatever. You could do 3 blog posts. You could do 3 emails. It doesn't really matter what the content is, but you're essentially going to teach about something over 3 chunks of content. I won't go into the structure, but because Jeff in his book has a whole structure of what you'll talk about, and he even has talking points and things like that, and it's easy to fill in. But you're going to teach something. You're going to show people how they can transform something into something else, and you're going to show them, the opportunity that's there, and then what the result is what the future looks like once they get there. You're going to share stories. You're going to share case studies, things like that during this. But essentially, you're going to teach something. Now, normally this is used to launch a product, but you've got a podcast, so you don't have to worry necessarily about launching a product. So at the end of your last piece of content, your 3rd video, whatever, you're really just going to do a call to action to your podcast. You're going to say, hey, if you enjoyed this, you should totally check out my podcast, because this is what we do every week on my podcast. And the reason this works is it's a significant amount of content on social media that you're asking people to participate in. You're giving them a heads up before it comes out. Again, it's another big rock that's going to create some buzz. It's going to be like a webinar. It's going to be some significant thing that people have to come check out. And it can get shared, and it works wonderfully that way. So before I leave you, those are the ways that you can think inwardly first and then outwardly to grow your audience. But I also want you to think about the different types of listeners that are out there. You have the people still, even though more than half of Americans, if you're in the United States, and a lot more people around the world are listening to podcasts now, there's still people out there who don't know about podcasts that might read your blog or they might follow you on social media. So don't stop talking about, hey, what is a podcast? What is my podcast? How do you listen to my podcast? How do you find my show? Make sure you tell people how to do that, because you do have a significant number of people out there in your audience, in your community, that may still not know, and may not know it's easy to go to your site or go to this app or go to this other way to listen to podcasts. And then remember that even amongst podcast listeners, there are people who don't know you. Okay, so it's really important on your episodes to share testimonials from listeners, from clients, read reviews, do listener spotlights, ask people to submit questions where you focus on them. We talked about that a little bit earlier. But remember that helps podcast listeners who don't know you find you and trust you. If they can hear that so-and-so loved this show in a review, or they listened to one episode because someone shared it with them, and then they heard a testimonial from another listener who talked about another episode that they might want to check out. So think about those things. And finally, like, the best way to do this and the best way to grow your audience is to just create content that matters to real people. Okay, we talked about this earlier. When you create good content and you're listening to your audience and you're giving people what they want, what they need, that works, and it has to matter. If people aren't responding to you, if your downloads aren't growing, you likely aren't asking or listening to your audience. So always listen to your audience and create content that matters to them. With market oversaturation, people are overwhelmed by the vast amount of content available to consume. That's why podcasting is such an essential strategy for business promotion. However, starting your own podcast is no simple feat. You need the right guidance to make sure that your podcast stands out from the rest and puts you on the path towards success. That's where my podcast launch intensive comes in. It provides a 10-week intensive training course with 4 to 5 activities for people to complete each week, allowing them to overcome the common obstacles for a podcast launch. The main goal of the podcast launch intensive is to help you save on time, effort, and money caused by common do-it-yourself podcast mistakes. It's about making intentional decisions that will help you get started and find success in your podcasting journey. Join the intensive today. Visit DannyOsmond.com/PLI to find out more.